My name is Jack Riley. At least that's what it says on the driver's license in my wallet, the one with the face that I barely recognize in the mirror anymore. The real Jack Riley died 15 years ago in a fire that was officially ruled an accident. They were very good at arranging accidents. They told me the fire was an accident, the same way they told me her death was an accident. A random, meaningless tragedy of slick roads and bad timing. They give you a story, a clean, plausible narrative to hold on to, and they expect you to live inside it. For a long time I did, but the silence has worn thin over the years. It's starting to fray at the edges, and I can hear the static bleeding through again. I can't live inside their story anymore. Someone else needs to know the truth before it's buried for good. Before the last echo of that place fades completely. I'm in a motel room. I don't know where. Somewhere in the Midwest. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the small, blinking red light on this cheap digital recorder. It's the only star in this darkness. It's time to tell you about the place they called Ironwood. It's time to tell you what we found at facility Panopticon. The story doesn't begin here, in this stale, anonymous room. It begins in the year 2005, on a cold, gray morning in Anchorage, Alaska. The contract was simple, almost insultingly so for a team with our credentials. Decommissioning. That's the clean corporate term for it. It sounds like you're taking a gentle old machine offline, pulling its plug after a long and faithful service. The reality is messier. It means digital demolition. It means walking into a place that the government no longer wants to exist, and making sure every last byte of data, every server, every hard drive, every kilobyte of information is not just deleted, but physically and irrevocably destroyed. My company, a small, highly specialized firm out of Virginia, was the best in the business. We were the digital janitors who came in after the party was over to clean up the kind of messes that couldn't be swept under a rug. We dealt in secrets, but our job wasn't to know them. It was to annihilate them. The client was, as it often was, an anonymous three-letter agency fronted by a shell corporation with a name like a provincial law firm. The pay was exceptional, and the instructions were clear. Fly to Anchorage, meet a liaison, take a charter flight to a remote site designated Ironwood, and perform a complete digital systems wipe and physical destruction of all data-bearing hardware. Period. No questions asked. We were paid for our discretion as much as for our expertise. There were 4 of us. I was the team lead. Jack Riley, 48 years old at the time, more experienced in navigating the labyrinth of government contracts than the circuitry we were there to destroy. I was the pragmatist, the one who kept the job on schedule and on budget, the one who made sure the paperwork was filed and the clients were happy. Then there was Marcus Thorne, our lead systems analyst. Mark was brilliant, maybe a little too aware of it. He was barely 30, a product of MIT, and he saw the world as a series of complex systems to be reverse engineered and, in this case, dismantled. He had a kind of arrogant confidence that could be grating, but when it came to enterprise-level server architecture, especially the bespoke, paranoid kind the government loved, he was a genuine artist. David Miller, or Dave, was our hardware guy. He was the oldest of us, maybe mid-50s, ex-Army Signals Corps, quiet and methodical. Dave didn't talk much, but he could take apart a server rack with the precision of a watchmaker and reduce a stack of hard drives to glittering dust with a portable industrial shredder he treated with an almost paternal affection. He had a way of looking at things, a deep, weary observation in his eyes that suggested he'd seen his share of strange jobs in strange places. And finally, there was Kevin Chen, the rookie. He was our junior technician, fresh out of college, eager and a little starstruck by the whole shadowy world of government contracting. It was his first major field assignment. He was a good kid, smart and hardworking, but you could see the nervous energy buzzing just under his skin. The journey began on a tarmac that smelled of jet fuel and frozen sea salt. Our liaison was a man in a crisp, dark suit who didn't give us a name. He just checked our identification, handed us a heavy-duty Pelican case full of satellite phones and emergency beacons, standard procedure for off-grid jobs, and pointed us toward a beat-up de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter that looked like it had been flying since the Vietnam War. Its paint was faded and chipped, its propellers looked slightly bent, and its skis were caked with old brown ice. The pilot was a man who matched the plane. He introduced himself as Sully, a leathery-skinned man with a network of fine wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of decades squinting into the Arctic sun. He had a thick, gray beard and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He grunted a hello, tossed our gear into the back with a practiced indifference, and gestured for us to climb in. The cabin was cramped and smelled faintly of fish and oil. It was unheated, and the cold was immediate and penetrating. I remember settling into a worn canvas seat, the metal frame icy against my back, and looking over at my team. Mark was already looking pale, his usual confidence replaced by a clear discomfort with the rickety aircraft. Kevin was staring out the small, scratched window, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Dave was just sitting there, impassive, his hands resting on his knees, looking like a man who had been in far worse conveyances. The engines coughed to life with a shuddering roar that vibrated through the entire fuselage. It wasn't a smooth modern hum. It was a loud, mechanical, angry protest. Sully didn't bother with any kind of safety briefing. He just taxied onto the runway and took off with a lurch that pressed us all back into our seats. As we climbed, the city of Anchorage fell away, replaced by a vast, intimidating wilderness of white and gray and dark, angry green. It was an endless carpet of snow-covered tundra and dense black forests of spruce, a landscape that felt ancient and utterly indifferent to human existence. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of bruised-looking clouds. We flew for what felt like an eternity, the drone of the engines a monotonous, hypnotic hum that made conversation impossible. I watched the landscape scroll by below, a brutal, beautiful emptiness that went on forever. There were no roads, no towns, no signs of life, just the occasional frozen river, a silver scar on the white skin of the world. It was the kind of place where a person, or a secret, could disappear without a trace. After about 2 hours, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Sully leaning back from the cockpit. He had to shout over the engine noise. "Another hour. You fellas ever been this far north?" I shook my head. He grinned, a flash of white in his weathered face. "Different world up here? Things get funny?" "Funny how?" Mark yelled back, his voice tight. Sully's grin widened. "The lights, for one. See things in the sky that ain't on any flight plan? And the ground? Old prospectors used to say there are places out here where time gets stretched thin, like an old rubber band. You walk into a valley and you feel like you've been there for a week. Walk out and only an hour's passed." He winked. "Or so they say. Magnetic anomalies, probably. Messes with your head." I dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of tall tale old-timers tell to spook the city folk. It was a standard part of the experience. But Dave was listening intently, his brow furrowed. He'd heard stories like that before, from old buddies who'd worked on the Dew Line stations during the Cold War. Places where the silence was so deep it started to play tricks on you. The first real sign that something was off happened about 30 minutes later. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Kevin, who had been fiddling with a handheld GPS unit he'd brought along, suddenly sat up straight. Jack?" he said, his voice hesitant. "Something's weird." He held up the device. The screen, which should have been showing our coordinates and a steady track across the map, was a mess of flickering static and nonsensical symbols. The digital compass was spinning wildly, a frantic, useless blur. Mark leaned over to look. "It's magnetic interference," he said, a little too quickly. "This region is known for high-grade iron ore deposits. It'll play hell with any unshielded electronics." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. But then I looked toward the cockpit. I could see the panel from my seat. The plane's own navigation system, a much more robust and shielded piece of military-grade equipment, was also malfunctioning. The needles on the analog compasses were twitching erratically, and the digital readouts were flashing error codes. Sully was hunched over the controls, his knuckles white. He wasn't grinning anymore. He tapped one of the gauges, then another. He flicked a switch, and a crackle of static filled the cabin from the radio. Through the noise, for just a second, I heard something else. It sounded like a voice, a calm, emotionless voice, reading a string of numbers in German, a numbers station, the kind of cryptic Cold War broadcast that hadn't been widely used in over a decade. The static swallowed it as quickly as it had appeared. Sully cut the radio and banked the plane hard to the left. He pointed out his window. "There she is," he yelled. "Visual contact. Good thing, too. Flying blind out here is a good way to become a permanent part of the scenery." I leaned over to look, and my first impression of Ironwood was one of sharp, geometric wrongness. It didn't belong there. In the middle of that wild, untamed expanse of snow and rock, there was a perfect, unnatural clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a collection of low, windowless, brutalist concrete buildings. They were connected by covered walkways, forming a sterile, functional complex that looked more like a microprocessor than a prison. The whole thing was encircled by a double row of high chain-link fences topped with coils of razor wire that glinted dully in the flat, gray light. There was a single watchtower, but it was dark. There was no smoke from any chimneys, no vehicles in the motor pool, no sign of any human presence at all. It looked like a scale model of a secret base, dropped in the middle of nowhere and forgotten. Sully circled once, then brought the otter down for a surprisingly smooth landing on a cleared patch of frozen earth that served as a runway. The moment the engines died, a silence fell that was so profound, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. It was a dead silence. No birds, no wind, not even the hum of insects. It was the sound of a world holding its breath. We climbed out of the plane, and the cold hit us like a physical blow. It was sharp and clean and felt like it was freezing the moisture in my lungs. Sully started unloading our gear. "I'll be back in 72 hours, he said, not looking at us. "Be ready. I don't like to linger around this place." He looked up at the main gate, his expression unreadable. "Gives me the creeps." With that, he climbed back into his plane, fired up the engines, and took off, leaving the four of us standing alone in the vast, unnerving silence of the Alaskan wilderness. The gates to the facility were hanging slightly ajar, swinging back and forth in a wind I couldn't feel. There were no guards, no lights. The entire facility was waiting for us, and it felt like it had been holding its breath for a very long time. We stood there for a long moment, the four of us, just small figures against the immense white backdrop, dwarfed by the scale of the landscape and the brutalist architecture of the facility. The air was so cold and still that our breath hung in front of our faces in thick, crystalline clouds that refused to dissipate. I could hear the frantic thump of my own heart, a lonely drum in the suffocating quiet. I pulled up the collar of my parka, the synthetic fabric crinkling loudly in the silence, and took charge. "All right," I said, my voice sounding thin and small in the open air. "Let's move. Dave, you and Kevin grab the primary gear. Mark, you're with me. We do a preliminary sweep of the main building, establish a base of operations in the control center. Standard procedure. It felt good to fall back on procedure. It was a shield, a set of rules to impose on a situation that already felt deeply, fundamentally unruly. Dave and Kevin nodded, their faces grim, and began unlatching the heavy Pelican cases. Mark, pulling on a pair of thick gloves, fell into step beside me as we started walking toward the open gate. The snow on the ground was old and hard-packed, crunching under our boots with a sound like breaking glass. As we got closer to the fence, I noticed something odd. There were no tracks. None. Not from vehicles. Not from people. The snow lay in a smooth, undisturbed blanket right up to the perimeter, except for a single narrow path leading from the runway to the gate. A path that was now marred only by our own fresh footprints. It was as if no one had entered or left this place in months, maybe longer. We passed through the first gate, the metal groaning on its hinges as I pushed it wider. The space between the two fences was a sterile no man's land, about 20 feet wide. The second gate was also unlocked. We stepped through it and were inside the compound proper. The feeling of being watched was immediate and overwhelming. It was an irrational, primal sensation, the kind of thing that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. My logical mind knew the place was abandoned, that we were the only living souls for 100 miles, but my instincts were screaming that we were trespassers in a place that was still very much occupied. The concrete walls of the building seemed to absorb all sound, making the silence even deeper, more claustrophobic. Mark must have felt it too. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his face tight with a tension that his usual intellectual arrogance couldn't conceal. "This place is a fortress," he muttered, his voice low. "What the hell were they doing here?" "Our job isn't to ask," I reminded him, my voice harsher than I intended. "It's to work." The main entrance was a heavy insulated steel door. It, too, was unlocked. I pushed it open and we were hit by a blast of stale, recycled air that had a strange metallic tang to it, like ozone or burnt electronics. It was the smell of a machine that has been running on its own for a very long time. We stepped inside, into a small, sterile reception area. There was a single desk made of brushed steel, and behind it, a thick pane of bulletproof glass. Everything was clean. Too clean. There was no dust, no debris, no sign of hasty departure. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. "Power's on," Mark observed, pointing to a small green LED glowing on a wall panel. "Looks like the facility is running on an automated auxiliary generator, probably a small geothermal unit judging by the specs in the briefing." Our briefing had been sparse, but it had mentioned a self-sustaining power source designed for long-term, unmanned operation. It was meant to keep the essential systems, climate control and security, running in a low-power state indefinitely. We moved from the reception area into the main corridor. It was long and white, the floor made of polished concrete that reflected the cold, even light of the fluorescent tubes humming faintly overhead. The walls were lined with heavy steel doors, each with a small rectangular slot at eye level and a digital lock panel next to it. It was a prison, no doubt about it, but it was unlike any I'd ever seen. It was too clean, too modern, too clinical. It didn't feel like a place for punishment. It felt like a laboratory for containing something. As we walked, our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the long hall. I ran a gloved hand along one of the walls. It was cold, unnervingly so, colder than the air. It felt like the chill was radiating out from the very structure of the building. And that smell, that faint, metallic odor, was stronger here. It was a clean smell, but it was wrong. It was the smell of immense power being used for something unnatural. We found the central control room at the end of the main corridor. The door was thicker than the others, with a heavy, wheel-like lock mechanism like on a bank vault. This, too, was unlocked. I turned the wheel, and the door swung open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The control room was a large, circular chamber, and it was the source of the humming we'd been hearing. The walls were a solid bank of equipment racks, filled with servers and data storage units, all humming away quietly, their little lights blinking in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. In the center of the room was a large, semicircular console with a dozen security monitors, all of them dark. This was our target. This was the brain of Facility Ironwood. This was what we had come to destroy. I walked over to the main console and ran my hand over the cool, dark surface. There was a single coffee mug sitting next to one of the keyboards. I picked it up. It was a standard issue, thick ceramic mug, the kind you find in any government office, and it was warm. Not hot, not even lukewarm. Just faintly, perceptibly warm, as if someone had been holding it just a few minutes ago. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I held the mug out to Mark. "Feel this." He took it, his eyes widening as his fingers registered the faint warmth. That's not possible," he whispered. "The last personnel were evacuated over 6 months ago. The official log said so." "Check the system logs," I ordered, my voice low and urgent. "Find out when the last user logged into this console." Mark, his face now pale, dropped the mug onto the console with a clatter and sat down at the keyboard. His fingers flew across the keys, his technical confidence returning as he submerged himself in a task he understood. While he worked, I walked the perimeter of the room, my hand resting on the butt of the heavy flashlight on my belt. The feeling of being watched was a physical presence in this room. It felt like it was emanating from the dark, silent monitor screens, from the blinking lights on the server racks. It felt like the machine itself was aware of us. Just as Dave and Kevin arrived, dragging the equipment cases, Mark let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "The logs are wiped. Not just deleted, but professionally, forensically scrubbed. There's no record of any user activity for the past 10 years. But the system uptime, Jack, the core operating system hasn't been rebooted in 3,472 days. It's been running continuously for almost a decade. We set up our base of operations in that room. Dave and Kevin began the laborious process of mapping the physical hardware, tracing cables, and preparing our own diagnostic equipment. I tried to focus on the logistics of the job, on the checklist of tasks we had to complete, but my mind kept coming back to that warm coffee mug. It was a small thing, a tiny, impossible detail, but it was like a crack in the foundation of reality. It was a sign that the story we had been told was a lie. As the hours passed and the gray afternoon light outside began to fade into a deep, Arctic twilight, a sense of deep unease settled over our team. Kevin was jumpy, dropping a tool with a loud clang that made us all flinch. Dave was even quieter than usual, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the room. Even Mark, for all his bravado, kept throwing nervous glances at the dark monitor screens. Later that evening, as I was going over the facility schematics, I found a small, secondary document tucked away in the digital files. It wasn't part of the main architectural plans. It was a project proposal addendum, heavily redacted. Most of the text was just solid black bars, but the project title was there, clear as day. It wasn't called Ironwood. The project's real name was Panopticon, and beside the name was a small, unfamiliar symbol, a stylized drawing of an eye inside a perfect circle. It was a symbol I'd seen before, I realized with a jolt. It had been etched almost invisibly into the side of that warm coffee mug. As the first night fell, a deep, resonant darkness that seemed to have physical weight, we were deep into the first phase of our work. The plan was to do a full diagnostic and backup of the surveillance system's master index before initiating the wipe. It wasn't strictly necessary. Our job was to destroy, not to analyze. But Mark insisted. He argued it was the only way to be certain we understood the full scope of the system architecture and could guarantee a 100% clean wipe. It was a matter of professional pride for him. I agreed, partly because he was right, and partly because I think we all felt a subconscious need to understand the machine before we killed it. The control room was our sanctuary, a small island of light and humming machinery against the vast, silent darkness of the facility and the wilderness beyond. Dave had set up a portable coffee maker, and the familiar smell of brewing coffee was a small, comforting anchor to normalcy in a place that felt anything but. Kevin was dutifully labeling network cables, his movements quick and nervous. I was at the main console with Mark, watching as he navigated the system's archaic command line interface. "This is beautiful, in a terrifying Cold War sort of way," Mark said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. His fear seemed to have been temporarily eclipsed by his professional fascination. "It's a closed loop, completely air-gapped from the outside world. The storage system isn't digital tape or standard hard drives. It looks like some kind of crystalline data matrix. I've only ever read about this stuff in DARPA theoretical papers from the 80s. The storage density is astronomical. There must be petabytes of data here. Decades of it." He gestured to the bank of a dozen large monitors in front of us. "These are just the display terminals. The real system is a beast." He typed a command, and with a soft electronic chime, the monitors flickered to life. For a moment, they displayed a cascade of green text, diagnostic information scrolling too fast to read. Then, they settled into a grid of black and white images. They showed the empty corridors, the sterile cell blocks, the silent mess hall, the vacant medical bay, hundreds of camera feeds, a god's eye view of every inch of the empty prison. The images were crisp and clear, the quality far better than I would have expected from a system of this vintage. "Okay, I'm initiating a playback of the most recent archives," Mark announced. "Let's start from 12 hours before final personnel evac. See what the last day looked like." He typed another command. The images on the screens didn't change. They continued to show the empty, silent hallways. "That's odd," Mark murmured, frowning. "The index shows the files are there, but the playback isn't initiating. It seems to be locked on the live feed." "Live feed?" I asked, confused. "The place is empty? The live feed should be exactly what we're seeing." "Yeah, but the system should let me switch to the archives," he insisted, his fingers tapping impatiently at the keyboard. "It's like the play command is being overridden by a higher-level function I don't have access to. It's stuck in record." He sighed in frustration. "Fine. Let's just do a spot check of the camera integrity before we go for the full system reboot." "Kevin," he called out, without taking his eyes off the screen, "I need you to go down to cell block C, corridor 4. I'm getting a weird energy fluctuation reading from camera C47. Probably just a faulty power conduit, but I want to be sure. Take a multimeter, check the voltage at the junction box." Kevin, grateful for a simple concrete task, nodded eagerly. "On it." He grabbed a tool belt and a flashlight and headed out of the control room, his footsteps echoing down the long main corridor until they faded. We watched him on the monitors. We could track his progress as he moved from the view of one camera to the next, a small, solitary figure in the vast, empty facility. He turned a corner and appeared in the corridor labeled Cell Block C4 on the monitor. "Okay, I see him," Mark said, pointing to one of the smaller screens. "That's the feed from C47. Looks clear enough?" We watched the small black and white image of Kevin walking down the hall. He was about halfway down when, on the screen, his foot seemed to catch on something. He flailed his arms for a moment, then went down hard, landing flat on his back. A small, dark object, his multimeter, skittered across the floor. He lay still for a second, then sat up, rubbing the back of his head. "What the hell?" I said, leaning closer to the monitor. "What did he trip on? The floor looks perfectly smooth." Mark zoomed in on the image. "I don't see anything. Maybe a loose tile?" Weird. We kept watching the screen. The on-screen Kevin got to his feet, brushed himself off, and continued down the hall to the junction box at the far end. He fiddled with it for a minute, then gave us a thumbs up, which we saw on the monitor. He then turned and started walking back. Everything seemed normal, but a deep, cold knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. Something was profoundly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. About 5 minutes passed in silence. We were just waiting for Kevin to get back to the control room. Then I heard it, the faint, distant sound of footsteps from the main corridor. It was Kevin, returning from his errand. "Here he comes," Dave said, sipping his coffee. I looked up from the monitors and watched the entrance to the control room. Kevin appeared in the doorway. He started to say something, then his foot caught on the metal threshold of the door. He flailed his arms in a desperate windmilling motion, a look of surprise on his face. He went down hard, landing flat on his back with a loud thud that echoed in the quiet room. His multimeter flew from his grasp and skittered across the polished concrete floor, coming to a stop near my feet. He lay there for a second, stunned, before slowly sitting up, rubbing the back of his head. "Ow. Damn. Slipped," he groaned. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the gentle hum of the servers and the buzzing of the lights overhead. Dave's coffee cup was frozen halfway to his lips. Mark was staring at Kevin on the floor, then at the monitor, then back at Kevin. His face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. My own mind was struggling to process what I had just witnessed. It wasn't just a similar event. It was identical. The way he fell, the way his arms pinwheeled, the exact trajectory of the multimeter as it flew from his hand. It was a perfect, one-to-one replay of what we had seen on that monitor 5 minutes earlier. But it wasn't a replay. It was live, and the monitor had shown it to us before it happened. My blood ran cold. I looked at the bank of monitors, at the dozens of feeds showing empty rooms and silent corridors. They weren't recordings of the past. They weren't live feeds of the present. The impossible, sickening truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. The cameras were showing us the future. For a long time, nobody spoke. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the low, indifferent hum of the server racks and Kevin's soft groans as he shakily got to his feet. He looked at our faces, a puzzled expression on his. What's wrong with you guys?" he asked, his voice still a little dazed. Mark just pointed a trembling finger at the monitor, the one still showing the feed from corridor C47. The image on the screen was of an empty hallway. The event was over. It now existed only in our shared, horrified memory. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Run that back? Play back the last 10 minutes from that camera?" Mark, moving like a man in a trance, turned to the keyboard. His usual fluid confidence was gone. His fingers were stiff and clumsy as he typed. He hit the enter key. Nothing happened. The screen continued to show the empty corridor. "It won't," he stammered, his voice cracking. "It's like I told you. The system is locked. It won't access the archives. It only shows what's happening now." "No," Dave said, his voice low and gravelly. He had finally put his coffee cup down. He was staring at the monitors with an expression of dawning, superstitious dread. "That's not what it's showing. Not now. It's showing what's next." The implication of his words hung in the air, a monstrous, unbelievable concept. My mind, trained for logic and process and protocol, was violently rejecting it. It was impossible. A violation of every known law of physics. There had to be an explanation. A delay, I said, grabbing at the most plausible straw I could find. It has to be a system lag, a massive one. The data is getting bottlenecked somewhere, stored in a buffer for 5 minutes before it gets displayed. Mark shook his head, a frantic, desperate motion. No, Jack. You don't understand this architecture. There is no buffer. The data path from the camera sensor to the display matrix is instantaneous. It's a quantum entangled relay system. It's designed specifically to eliminate latency. The signal should be faster than light, not 5 minutes slower. He ran his hands through his hair, his eyes wild. It's not a lag. It's a temporal displacement. The data stream is arriving before the event it's capturing. It makes no sense. It's a paradox. Information can't travel backwards in time. We need to test it, I said, the words feeling like sawdust in my mouth. My pragmatism was a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. We need to run a controlled experiment. We need proof. Proof? Kevin squeaked, his face ashen. I've got a giant bruise on my back that feels like pretty good proof. We need undeniable, repeatable proof, I insisted, my voice harder now, trying to impose order on the chaos that was threatening to engulf us. Dave, you're with me. I turned to our grizzled hardware specialist. He just looked at me, his eyes dark, and gave a slow, reluctant nod. He understood. This was no longer about decommissioning a facility. This was about confronting something that shouldn't exist. Here's what we're going to do, I said, laying out the plan. Dave, you and I are going to the mess hall. On the way, I'm going to stop, turn around, and drop my flashlight. You are going to pick it up. We will decide on a specific time to do this. Mark, you will watch the monitor for the mess hall corridor. You will tell us if you see it happen before we do it. I looked at my watch. The luminous dial read 10:17 p.m. At exactly 10:30, I said, I will drop the flashlight. Not a second before, not a second after. Synchronize watches. We all held up our wrists, the small synchronized clicks of the watch bezels sounding like gunshots in the tense silence. Dave and I left the control room, the heavy door hissing shut behind us. The walk to the mess hall was the longest of my life. The corridor seemed to stretch on into infinity, the fluorescent lights overhead humming a single maddening note. Every step echoed. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. I was acutely aware of the small, dark domes of the security cameras that watched us from the ceiling, spaced every 50 feet. They were no longer inanimate objects. They were eyes. They were the eyes of a seer, a prophet, a god that lived in the wires of this place. We reached the corridor leading to the mess hall. We stood there, in the middle of the empty hall, in silence. I looked at my watch. 10:25. 5 minutes to go. The silence was absolute. I could hear Dave's steady, rhythmic breathing next to me. I focused on my own, trying to keep it from becoming ragged. Back in the control room, Mark and Kevin were staring, mesmerized, at the monitor labeled Mess Hall Corridor. The black and white image showed the two of us, Dave and me, standing perfectly still. The seconds ticked by. On their screen, the timestamp in the corner read 10:30 and 0 seconds. And then, they saw it. They saw my on-screen self, as if moved by an invisible puppeteer, suddenly turn. They saw the flashlight slip from my hand, tumble end over end, and clatter to the concrete floor. They saw Dave bend down, pick it up, and hand it back to me. The whole event took maybe 5 seconds. And then the image on their screen was of us, once again, standing perfectly still. A full 5 minutes before it happened in reality. Mark told me later that he felt a wave of vertigo so intense he almost threw up. It was the feeling of the world tilting on its axis. Kevin just started quietly weeping, his face in his hands. In the corridor, I watched the second hand on my watch sweep towards the 12. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. My palm, holding the heavy maglite, was slick with sweat. This is stupid, a part of my brain screamed. This is a prank, a hallucination, a trick. But the other part, the cold, professional part, knew that we had to see it through. The second hand hit the 12. 10:30. I took a breath. I turned. I let the flashlight slip from my fingers. It fell, tumbling end over end, and hit the floor with a loud, echoing clatter. The sound was obscene in the silence. Dave, his face a grim, emotionless mask, bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to me. His hand was steady. Mine was not. We had just performed a miracle. We had just proven the impossible. We were no longer in a decommission job. We were trapped in a cage where the bars were made of time itself. We walked back to the control room without saying a word. When we entered, the looks on Mark's and Kevin's faces told us everything. There was no more room for doubt, no more comforting rationalizations. The entire surveillance system, every single camera in this godforsaken place, was not recording the past. It was broadcasting our immediate, unalterable future. The hours that followed were a blur of denial, frantic theorizing, and rising panic. The control room, once our sanctuary, now felt like the center of a spider's web. We were the flies, and the monitors on the wall were the spider's eyes, watching not where we were, but where we were going to be. Mark was at the console, his initial shock replaced by a feverish, desperate energy. He was a scientist confronted with a phenomenon that shattered his entire understanding of the universe, and his only defense was to try and dissect it. He brought up schematics, ran diagnostics, and muttered a constant stream of technical jargon and half-formed theories. "It's got to be the core," he kept saying, more to himself than to us. "The crystal matrix. It's not just a storage medium. It must be interacting with local space-time. A quantum observer effect on a macro scale. Maybe the geothermal source is tapping into a unique geological formation, a gravitational anomaly that bends causality." His words were a desperate attempt to put a scientific label on a nightmare, to cage the monster with terminology. It wasn't working. The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent beneath his manic energy. Kevin had completely shut down. He was sitting in a corner, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth almost imperceptibly. He refused to look at the monitors. He had his eyes squeezed shut, as if by not looking, he could make it not be real. Dave, in his own quiet way, was handling it with a grim stoicism that was almost as unsettling as Kevin's breakdown. He was methodically checking our gear, cleaning tools, organizing supplies. He was a soldier preparing his kit for a battle he knew he couldn't win, finding solace in the familiar ritual of preparation. And me? I was trying to hold it all together. I was the lead. I was responsible for these men. I paced the room, a caged animal, my mind racing. My training was in risk management, in contingency planning. But how do you plan for a contingency when the outcome is already known? How do you manage a risk that has already occurred in the future? The very concept was a logical loop that my brain couldn't escape. "We have to fight it," I said, the words sounding hollow even to me. "We have to prove it's not absolute. We have to break the loop." Mark looked up from the console, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "How, Jack? How do you fight physics? It's not a sentient thing, it's a process. It's like trying to fight gravity by deciding not to fall." "We make a choice," I insisted, my voice rising. "We see something on a monitor, and we do the opposite. Consciously, deliberately, we refuse to walk down the path it shows us." Dave stopped polishing a wrench and looked at me, his expression full of a deep, weary pity. "Son," he said, his voice soft, "you can't choose to do the opposite of something if the choice to do the opposite is the thing you were always going to do." My head spun. The deterministic trap was perfect. It wasn't just showing us the future. It was showing us the future that already accounted for us seeing the future. Our reactions, our attempts to defy it, were already part of the script. And then, it happened. The event that shattered our last, desperate hopes of having any control. Mark, in his frantic search for answers, had isolated the feeds from the control room itself. 4 cameras were watching us, 1 in each corner of the circular room. He had them displayed on the main central monitor. We were watching ourselves, in black and white, a strange, recursive echo of our own confinement. We had been trying to avoid looking at it, but it was impossible. It was a morbid, magnetic fascination. Suddenly, the image on the main monitor flickered. The timestamp jumped forward 5 minutes, and we saw it. We saw a scene of sudden, vicious violence. The black and white image showed Mark leaping up from his chair, his face contorted in a mask of rage. It showed him shouting at Dave, who was standing by the equipment racks. The silent, grainy figures gesticulated wildly. Then we saw Mark shove Dave hard. Dave stumbled back, knocking over a stack of diagnostic equipment, which crashed to the floor. Dave retaliated, shoving Mark back. The on-screen version of me and Kevin rushed forward to separate them. The scene was chaotic, ugly, and deeply personal. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the feed returned to normal, showing the 4 of us staring, horrified, at the screen. A thick, toxic silence descended on the room. Mark was frozen in his chair, his face ashen. Dave was standing by the racks, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He was staring at Mark with a look of pure, murderous contempt. "I would never," Dave said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I would never put my hands on a team member." "And I wouldn't either," Mark shot back, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "That's not me. That's not us. It's a trick. The machine it's generating it. It's a deep fake, a projection." "We have to stop it," I said, my voice firm, trying to take control. "We know it's coming, so we will prevent it. Dave, you will not go near the equipment racks. You will sit over there, in that corner. Mark, you will not leave your chair. Nobody talks. We will sit here, in silence, for the next 10 minutes. We will not let it happen." It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was the only one I had. For a few minutes it seemed to work. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the servers. I watched the clock on the wall, the second hand crawling with agonizing slowness. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Then Kevin started to make a sound, a small, hiccuping, gasping sound. He was having a full-blown panic attack. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was hyperventilating. "It's in my head," he whimpered, clawing at his temples. "I can hear it. The humming. It's talking." Mark, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding my order, stood up. "Kevin, calm down. It's auditory pareidolia. Your brain is creating patterns in the white noise." "Get away from me!" Kevin shrieked, scrambling backwards away from Mark. Dave, seeing the kid in genuine distress, also stood up. "Hey kid, easy now. Just breathe." He started walking towards Kevin, his hands held out in a placating gesture. And just like that, the trap was sprung. Mark and Dave were both on their feet, moving. They were no longer in their designated safe zones. "It's the machine!" Mark suddenly yelled, his composure finally cracking completely. He wasn't talking to Kevin anymore. He was screaming at Dave, his finger pointed accusingly. This is your fault. Your superstitious, Luddite nonsense is what's scaring him. You and your stories about funny time. Dave stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly to face Mark, his face hardening into a granite mask of fury. My fault? He snarled. You're the one who couldn't leave it alone? The one who had to understand it. We had a job to do, wipe and destroy, but you had to poke the goddamn bear, you arrogant little prick. It's a machine, you old fool. It's not a bear. It's a machine that's showing us how we die. The argument escalated with shocking speed. It was like watching a chemical reaction, a volatile mixture that had finally reached its flashpoint. The words they were shouting were different from what we had anticipated, but the emotion, the raw, ugly anger, was the same. I saw it coming a second before it happened. Mark, his face purple with rage, took a step forward and shoved Dave in the chest. Shut up, he screamed. Dave, a man twice his size and with decades of military discipline, stumbled back. His shoulder hit the equipment rack, and a stack of expensive multimeters and oscilloscopes crashed to the floor with a shower of sparks and broken plastic. The sound was like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then Dave, his eyes blazing, lunged forward and shoved Mark with all his strength. You son of a bitch! I rushed forward, grabbing Mark's arm. Kevin, jarred out of his panic attack by the sudden violence, tried to get between them. We were a chaotic tangle of limbs and shouted curses. It was happening. It was happening exactly as the monitor had shown us. Not because we were puppets, but because we were human. The machine hadn't forced us. It had simply shown us our own nature. It had shown us a spark, and then it had watched, patiently, as we fanned it into a flame. We were trapped in a deterministic loop, forced to watch our own fates unfold on the monitors before they happened, and then live them out, step by agonizing step. We weren't just prisoners in a facility. We were prisoners of our own future. After the fight, a new kind of horror settled in. It was quieter, colder, and far more profound. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind the bitter ash of despair. We were no longer fighting the machine. We were no longer fighting each other. We had accepted in a deep, soul-crushing way that we had no agency. We were simply actors in a play that had already been written. Our lines fed to us 5 minutes in advance by the silent, judging eyes of the cameras. The control room became a tomb. We sat in a heavy, oppressive silence, each of us lost in our own private hell. Dave was methodically, almost obsessively, trying to repair the equipment Mark had broken, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a stony mask. Mark was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the dark screens, the fire of his intellect extinguished. He was a man who had built his entire identity on logic and reason, and he had just witnessed them be utterly, contemptuously dismantled. Kevin was back in his corner, wrapped in a thermal blanket, shivering uncontrollably, though the room was not cold. He was broken, and I was adrift. My role as a leader, a manager, was meaningless. How do you lead men who have no choices to make? I found myself staring at the monitors, unable to look away. It was a form of self-torture. I watched the black and white feeds of empty hallways and silent rooms, waiting for the next scene in our inevitable tragedy to be revealed. I thought about my wife, Sarah. I thought about the accident, a patch of black ice on a winding country road, a moment of lost control, a life extinguished in an instant. For years, I had tormented myself with the what-ifs. What if we had left 5 minutes earlier? What if I had taken the main highway instead? What if I had just been driving a little slower? I had always carried the crushing weight of those choices, the belief that a different decision, a tiny change, could have saved her. But now, in the cold, humming heart of this Alaskan nightmare, a new and even more monstrous possibility began to take root in my mind. What if there were no other choices? What if her death, like our impending fates, was just another scene that had been pre-recorded? The thought was an acid, dissolving the very foundations of my grief, replacing it with a cold, nihilistic void. Was my guilt as much of an illusion as my free will? The system, as if sensing the new direction of my thoughts, decided to pour salt in the wound. It was no longer content to just show us our interactions with each other. It began a targeted psychological assault, and I was its first subject. A small monitor in the corner of the console, one that had been dark until now, flickered to life. It wasn't a feed from inside the facility. The image was grainy, distorted, like old news footage. It was a dark, two-lane road at night. Snow was falling. I recognized it instantly. It was the road. The one where Sarah died. My breath caught in my throat. My heart felt like it had been seized in an icy fist. The camera's perspective was from the side of the road, looking out at the oncoming traffic. I saw the headlights of our old sedan cutting through the darkness. I could almost feel the cold vinyl of the steering wheel under my hands, hear the soft music playing on the radio, smell the faint scent of her perfume. I was watching a ghost of a memory, a ghost of a moment that had destroyed my life. On the screen, I saw the car hit the patch of ice. I saw it swerve, the tail end fishtailing wildly. I saw it slide, in sickening slow motion, across the center line and into the path of an oncoming truck. There was a silent, terrible flash of light as the two vehicles collided. Then, the screen went black. I let out a sound, a choked, guttural sob that was torn from the deepest part of my soul. It wasn't a memory. The camera angle was wrong. I had been inside the car. This was filmed from outside. It was an impossible perspective. Mark looked up, his eyes focusing on me for the first time in hours. "Jack, what is it?" I couldn't speak. I could only point a trembling finger at the dark screen. It's using the archives," Mark whispered, a new kind of horror dawning on his face. "It's not just showing us the future. It's accessing stored data and projecting it. But that's not from here. That footage, it couldn't exist." But it did. The machine wasn't just a prophet. It was a god, a cruel, omniscient god that had access to every moment, everywhere. It wasn't just showing us the future of this facility. It was showing me my own unchangeable past. The assault didn't stop there. It became more personal, more sadistic. It started to create things. On another monitor, a feed of one of the empty cells flickered on. Inside the cell, standing with her back to the camera, was a woman with long, dark hair. She was wearing Sarah's favorite blue coat. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly turned around. It wasn't Sarah. The face was a grotesque, distorted caricature, a funhouse mirror version of my wife, its eyes black, empty pits, its mouth twisted into a silent, mocking grin. It was a puppet made from my grief, designed for maximum cruelty. I slammed my fist down on the console, a wave of pure, white-hot rage washing over the despair. "Turn it off," I roared, my voice raw. "Mark, turn it all off. Shut it down." "I can't," he cried, his hands hovering uselessly over the keyboard. "The system has locked me out. I don't have administrative control anymore. It's in control of itself." The machine was toying with us. It was sentient or something close to it. It was aware of our fears, our traumas, and it was using them as weapons. It was a psychological war, and we were unarmed. We were trapped in a room with a monster that could wear the face of our deepest regrets. The final, catastrophic mistake was not born of anger, but of terror. The system turned its attention to Kevin. A monitor directly in front of his corner lit up. I don't know what it showed him. He let out a scream, a high, thin sound of pure animal terror that cut through the humming of the room. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild and unfocused. "No!" he shrieked, pointing at the screen. "Not that, I won't! I won't let it happen!" He lunged, not at the monitor, but at the main server rack behind it. It was the core of the Panopticon system, the physical housing for the crystalline data matrix Mark had been so fascinated by. Before any of us could react, he grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with all his might into the front of the server. There was a deafening crunch of metal and plastic, followed by a shower of brilliant blue sparks. An alarm, a deafening, high-pitched klaxon, began to blare throughout the facility. Red light started flashing, bathing the room in a hellish, pulsating glow. "Kevin, no!" I shouted, starting towards him, but it was too late. A plume of thick, acrid black smoke began to pour from the damaged server. A bright orange flame licked up from inside the chassis. The fire suppression system, a last automated defense, kicked in. With a heavy, grinding clang, a thick steel blast door slammed down over the entrance to the control room, sealing us inside. Another series of hisses and clunks sounded as nozzles in the ceiling released a flood of halon gas to smother the flames. The fire was extinguished in seconds, but the consequences were absolute. The klaxon died, but the red emergency lights continued to spin, casting long, dancing shadows around the smoke-filled room. The main power went dead. The humming of the servers, the buzz of the lights, the life of the facility, all ceased. The only light now was the hellish, rotating red glow. The only sound was our own ragged, desperate breathing. We were trapped. We were entombed. The system, in its final act of deterministic cruelty, had used our own panic to spring its ultimate trap. The silence that followed was a different kind. It wasn't the dead, watchful silence of the abandoned facility. It was the thick, choked silence of a tomb. The air was heavy with the chemical smell of the fire-suppressant gas and the lingering, burnt plastic stench of the ruined server. The only illumination came from the slowly rotating red emergency beacons, which painted the room in slow, rhythmic waves of blood-colored light. We were shadows in a crimson hell. For a long time, we just stood there, stunned, coughing in the haze. The immediate disastrous consequences of Kevin's act were brutally clear. The blast door was down. The main power was out. Our link to the outside world, tenuous as it was completely severed. We were sealed in the heart of the machine we had come to destroy. My first instinct was to check the door. I ran to it, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The steel was cold and immovable. There was no handle, no wheel, no manual override on this side. It was designed to contain a catastrophe, and from the inside, it was a perfect, seamless wall of metal. We were well and truly trapped. The emergency comms, I gasped, my throat raw from the smoke. The Pelican case. The sat phones. Dave, already moving with a grim purpose, located the case. He snapped it open. The satellite phone's small screen was dead. He tried the backup. Also dead. He held up the emergency beacon. Its power light was dark. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Whatever that surge did when the kid hit the rack, it must have sent an EMP through the room. Fried everything that wasn't hardened. All our gear. It's all just plastic and wire now. A new kind of dread began to creep in, a more primal, claustrophobic fear. This was no longer a philosophical horror about determinism. This was about the slow, creeping reality of running out of air, of being buried alive. Kevin was on the floor, weeping, curled into a fetal position. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words muffled. "I saw it on the screen. It showed me. Suffocating. Right here. I thought if I broke it... He trailed off into incoherent sobs. The irony was so cruel it was almost poetic. In his attempt to escape a predicted fate, he had single-handedly engineered it. Mark, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally stirred. He walked over to the bank of monitors. Most were dark, lifeless, but one, powered by a separate shielded emergency circuit, was still faintly glowing. It was the central monitor, the one that had shown us the fight. It was no longer displaying a camera feed. It was just a screen of faint, flickering, gray static. "It's not dead," Mark whispered, his voice filled with a strange, terrified awe. "The core matrix, it's still drawing power from somewhere. It's still active." As he said it, the static on the screen coalesced. It formed a shape, a pattern. It was the symbol we had seen before. The stylized eye inside a perfect circle. The symbol of Project Panopticon. It pulsed on the screen, a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a heartbeat. And then, the humming started again. It was different this time. It wasn't the clean, mechanical hum of servers. It was a low, guttural, organic thrumming sound. And it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around us. It was a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. The machine was no longer playing psychological games. It was shedding its technological skin. The ghost in the machine was coming out. The first physical manifestation was subtle. A heavy wrench that Dave had left on top of a console suddenly slid off, as if pushed by an unseen hand, and clattered to the floor. We all jumped. We tried to rationalize it. A vibration from the humming, the building settling. But we knew. Then across the room, one of the heavy, empty server racks, made of solid steel, began to groan. The sound of metal protesting, bending under an immense invisible pressure. We watched in stunned silence as one of its thick support legs slowly, impossibly began to buckle. With a screech of tearing metal, the entire rack tipped over, crashing to the floor with a deafening boom that shook the entire room. This was no longer a game of images on a screen. The force, the entity, whatever it was no longer just an observer. It had crossed over. It was a tangible presence in the room with us, and it was demonstrating its power. It was like a predator, freed from its cage, stretching its muscles. The psychological war was over. The physical assault had begun. We were no longer just its prisoners. We were its prey. The terror escalated quickly. The entity was no longer just showing its strength. It was actively hunting us. It started with Kevin. He was still on the floor, sobbing, when the thick, insulated power cable leading to the destroyed server rack began to move. It slithered across the floor like a black rubber snake propelled by some unseen force. It coiled itself around Kevin's ankle before he even realized what was happening. He let out a choked scream and tried to pull away, but the cable held fast, tightening its grip. "Help me!" he shrieked, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond sanity. Dave and I lunged for him, trying to pry the cable loose, but it was like pulling against solid steel. The cable dragged him, scraping him across the concrete floor towards the dark, smoking maw of the ruined server. His fingernails screeched against the floor, leaving faint white lines. He was screaming, a high, piercing sound that seemed to go on forever. And then, as the cable pulled him into the shadows of the wrecked equipment, the screaming just stopped, abruptly, followed by a wet, crunching sound that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. Dave and I recoiled in horror, our hands empty. Kevin was gone. He had fulfilled the prophecy he had seen on the screen. He had died, right there, suffocating in the dark heart of the machine. Dave and I were left alone in the crimson, pulsing light, our breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The low thrumming intensified, a predatory growl that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. "We have to get out," I said, my voice shaking. "There has to be a way." "There is no way, Jack," Dave said, his voice grim and resigned. He had seen too much. He was a man who understood when a battle was lost. "This is it. This is the end of the line." "No," I said, a cold, hard resolve beginning to crystallize in the pit of my stomach, displacing the fear. "No. I am not going to die in here, waiting for it to pick me off. If this is the end, I'm going to end it on my own terms." My mind was racing, connecting the dots, pulling together fragments of the schematics I had studied. The geothermal power source, the unstable nature of the crystal matrix, the emergency purge system for the reactor core. An idea, a desperate, suicidal, beautiful idea, began to form. "The core," I said, looking at Dave. "The power source. It's directly beneath us. If I can get to the primary control conduit and overload the coolant system, I can trigger a manual meltdown. A small one, but enough. Enough to vaporize this entire room. Enough to destroy the Matrix. To kill it." Dave stared at me, his eyes searching my face in the dim red light. He saw the resolve there. He saw that I was serious. And for the first time since we arrived, I saw a flicker of something other than despair in his eyes. It was a soldier's understanding. "The control conduit is on the lower level," he said, his voice now steady. "All business. Through that maintenance hatch in the floor. But the overload requires a 2-man key turn. A fail-safe. You can't do it alone." He looked from me to the dark corner where Kevin had vanished, and then at the pulsing, malevolent symbol on the monitor. He made his decision. "Okay," he said, giving a single sharp nod. "Okay. What's the plan?" Just as he spoke, the heavy vault-like door to the control room began to shudder. A deep, booming sound echoed through the room as something immense and powerful began to batter against it from the outside. The steel of the door began to glow a dull cherry red in the center, heating from the other side. A deep dent appeared, bulging inwards. The entity was trying to get in. Or maybe it was trying to keep us from getting out. It didn't matter. Our time was running out. "The plan is simple," I said, grabbing a heavy crowbar from our toolkit. "You hold it off. I go turn off the goddamn lights for good." I found the maintenance hatch in the floor, its location burned into my memory from the schematics. It was a round, steel plate, held down by 6 heavy bolts. While Dave stood guard, his own crowbar held like a baseball bat, his eyes fixed on the groaning, denting vault door, I went to work on the bolts. My hands were slick with sweat, my muscles screaming with effort. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal from the main door. Each turn of the wrench was an eternity. The booming intensified. Faster now. More frantic. The metal of the door was beginning to tear, thin, glowing cracks spreading from the central dent like a spiderweb. 1 bolt free. 2. 3. "Jack!" Dave yelled, his voice tight with strain. "Hurry!" I put all my weight into the wrench. 4. 5. The last bolt was rusted, frozen solid. I grunted, my vision swimming with black spots from the exertion. With a final agonizing shriek of metal, it gave way. I threw the wrench aside, and with Dave's help, we heaved the heavy steel plate off the opening. A wave of intensely cold, damp air washed over us from the darkness below. It smelled of wet earth and ozone. It was the smell of the deep places. I grabbed a flashlight, one of the few pieces of gear that had survived the EMP, and peered down. A narrow steel ladder descended into blackness. This was it, the descent into the lair. "I'm going," I said to Dave. He just nodded, not taking his eyes off the main door, which was now groaning and buckling, on the verge of collapse. "Give 'em hell, son," he said, his voice quiet. I swung my legs over the edge, my feet finding the cold, narrow rungs of the ladder, and began to climb down into the humming, absolute darkness that lay beneath the heart of Project Panopticon. The descent was like climbing down into the gullet of some vast, sleeping beast. The air grew colder, heavier, with every rung. The low, resonant humming that had filled the control room was 10 times louder down here, a physical vibration that worked its way up the steel ladder and into my bones, making my teeth chatter. My flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling circle in the oppressive darkness, revealing walls of raw, damp rock slick with condensation, interwoven with thick bundles of armored cables and conduits. This was the facility's hidden basement, the place where the sterile, high-tech prison above met the raw, ancient earth below. The ladder ended on a narrow metal catwalk. I stepped onto it, the grated floor clanging under my boots. The catwalk stretched out over a cavernous, dark space. I pointed my flashlight beam down, but the darkness was so profound that the light simply disappeared, swallowed by the void. The humming was coming from down there, from the unseen depths. It felt ancient, hungry. I started moving along the catwalk, following the thickest of the power conduits, the one labeled primary core feed, in faded stenciling. I had the schematics memorized. I was looking for the coolant regulation terminal, a small control box where the fail-safe keys could be inserted. The catwalk was narrow, and there was no railing. A single misstep would send me plunging into the abyss. Suddenly, I heard a sound from above, a deafening crash of tearing metal, followed by Dave's voice, a single, defiant roar. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that was more terrifying than the noise. I knew what it meant. The door was breached. Dave was gone. I was alone. A wave of despair washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I wanted to sit down, to give up, to let the darkness take me. But then I thought of Dave's last words. Give 'em hell. I thought of Kevin's terrified screams. I thought of Sarah. A cold, hard anger pushed the despair away. I wasn't just doing this to survive anymore. This was for them. This was vengeance. I pressed on, moving faster now, my flashlight beam dancing erratically ahead of me. The humming grew louder, and the very structure of the catwalk began to vibrate in sympathy. The air shimmered in my flashlight beam, distorting like a heat haze, even though it was freezing cold. The laws of physics felt thin down here, stretched to their breaking point. I saw something ahead, a small red light blinking in the darkness. The coolant terminal. I broke into a run, my boots slamming against the metal grate. I reached the terminal, a small steel box mounted on the cavern wall. There were 2 keyholes side by side, and a heavy, shielded lever marked Emergency Purge. The 2 keys, as per standard high-security protocol, were supposed to be held by 2 separate senior officers. But I knew from a footnote in the schematics that there was a single, master override key, kept in a small, locked panel on the terminal itself for catastrophic emergencies. A last resort. This qualified. I found the panel and pried it open with my crowbar. Inside, nestled in thick foam, was a single heavy brass key. As my fingers touched it, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, disorienting. And then a new sound began, a soft, whispering sound that seemed to come from inside my own head. You cannot stop it, the voice whispered. It was a chorus of voices, layered and distorted, male and female, young and old. It was the voice of the machine, of the entity, speaking directly into my consciousness. We have seen this moment. We have seen you fail. The air around me grew thick, and the darkness began to take shape. It wasn't a physical monster of flesh and bone. It was worse. The shadows themselves seemed to coalesce, to rise up and form shifting, impossible geometries. Corridors of pure darkness opened up in the solid rock wall, leading to nowhere. The catwalk beneath my feet seemed to stretch and twist, the far end receding into an infinite distance. It was trying to break my mind, to trap me in a labyrinth of perception. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the cold, solid weight of the key in my hand. "You may have seen this moment," I growled, my voice a ragged whisper in the disorienting silence. "But you haven't seen the end of it." I forced my eyes open. I ignored the impossible architecture that was writhing around me. I focused on the terminal, on the 2 keyholes. But there was only one key, the failsafe. You needed to turn both keys simultaneously. It was a puzzle, a final, cruel joke from the architects of this place. My mind raced, frantically searching for a solution. The key, the schematics, a footnote, something about the key's material, a high-tensile brass alloy. I remembered. It was a desperate long shot, mentioned in the technical addendum as a theoretical flaw in the failsafe design. The key was strong enough. I jammed the head of the key into the left keyhole. Then I took my crowbar, placed the tip of it into the hole on the handle of the key, and the other end against the edge of the right keyhole. Using the crowbar as a lever, I put all my weight into it, trying to force the single key to turn the mechanisms of both locks at once. The metal groaned. The key began to bend under the immense strain. "It will break," the voice whispered in my mind, a chorus of mocking laughter. "You will break." The pressure was immense. My muscles screamed. The crowbar slipped, gashing my hand. I ignored the pain, the warm blood running down my arm. I reset my grip and pushed again, roaring with effort and rage and grief. There was a loud, sharp crack. For a heart-stopping second, I thought the key had snapped, but it wasn't the key. It was the lock mechanism. Both tumblers had turned. A loud hydraulic hiss echoed through the cavern, and a green light blinked on above the purge lever. I had done it. I had beaten the final guardian. I grabbed the heavy, rubber-coated lever with both hands. I took one last deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, ancient air of the abyss. And as the impossible shift in darkness swirled around me, I pulled the lever down. "This is for Sarah," I whispered. And then, I gave them hell. The moment I pulled the lever, the world dissolved into pure, silent, white light. There was no sound, no sensation of heat or force, just an instantaneous, absolute obliteration of everything. The humming, the darkness, the cold, the pain in my hand. It was all gone, erased in a single silent flash. My consciousness, my very sense of self, unraveled. I was nothing, a mote of dust in an infinite white void. And then, oblivion. My story should have ended there. It would have been a clean ending, a hero's sacrifice. The man who went down with the ship to kill the monster. But the universe, or whatever cruel intelligence runs it, is rarely that kind. It rarely gives you the ending you deserve. The first sensation was the smell. A sterile, antiseptic smell. The smell of a hospital. Then the sound. The slow, rhythmic, electronic beep of a heart monitor. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were made of lead. When I finally managed to force them open, the light was blinding. I was in a bed with clean white sheets that felt impossibly soft against my skin. The room was white. The walls were white, the ceiling was white. There was no window. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and pain washed over me. My entire body ached with a deep, profound weariness. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, uncalloused. My left hand, the one I had gashed on the crowbar, was perfectly smooth, without a scar. There was an IV tube taped to my arm. How? How was I here? The meltdown. The light. I should be a cloud of vaporized atoms scattered across the Alaskan bedrock. The door to the room opened with a soft electronic hiss. 2 men walked in. They were identical in their anonymity. Both wore simple, dark, perfectly tailored suits. Both had bland, forgettable faces and calm, emotionless eyes. They were the men in black from the stories, made real. They didn't look like agents or soldiers. They looked like undertakers. One of them pulled up a simple metal chair and sat down beside my bed. The other remained standing by the door, his arms crossed. Neither of them smiled. "Mr. Riley," the seated man said. His voice was calm, neutral, like a synthesized voice from a computer. "It is good to see you are awake. We were beginning to worry." "Where am I?" I managed to croak, my voice a dry, unused rasp. "You are in a secure medical facility," he replied, offering no more information. "You were the sole survivor of the unfortunate accident at the Ironwood site." "Accident?" I whispered. "The fire?" The man nodded slowly. "A tragic electrical fire originating in the main server room. It triggered a catastrophic failure of the facility's power systems. You were found unconscious in a lower-level maintenance shaft thrown clear by a concussive blast from a ruptured conduit. You are very lucky to be alive." It was a story. A neat, plausible, perfectly constructed lie. They were handing it to me on a silver platter, expecting me to take it, to live inside it. "The others?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "They did not survive," the man said, his face a mask of polite professional sympathy. "Their bodies were recovered. A great tragedy. Their families have been notified and will be well compensated for their loss." The bureaucratic horror of it was more chilling than any monster. The casual, efficient way they were erasing it all. Erasing Dave. Erasing Kevin. Erasing the truth. "What we found down there," I started to say, my voice gaining a little strength. "Project Panopticon." The man held up a hand, a simple, gentle gesture that was also an absolute command to stop. "Mr. Riley," he said, his voice losing its neutral tone and taking on a hard, steel edge. "The project you were contracted for was the decommissioning of a standard classified data storage facility. Nothing more. Any stress-induced hallucinations or memories you may have from your ordeal are just that, a product of trauma. It is vital for your own well-being that you understand this." His meaning was crystal clear. It was a threat, veiled in the language of concern. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you recover," he said, standing up. "You will be given a new name, a new life, a generous pension for your services and your silence. You will move to a quiet town in the Midwest. You will forget you were ever in Alaska. You will forget the names of the men who died there. You will forget the name Panopticon. You will live a long, quiet, unremarkable life. This is not a request, Mr. Riley. This is your new reality." He walked to the door, pausing for a moment before he left. "We will be watching," he said, and the words hung in the sterile white room long after he was gone. He didn't mean it as a threat. He meant it as a statement of fact. They had their own Panopticon. And so, here I am, 15 years later. A ghost living a borrowed life in a town I don't know, under a name that isn't mine. I did what they told me. I lived the quiet life. I kept my mouth shut. I tried to forget, but I can't. Every night when I close my eyes, I see the red, pulsing light of the control room. I hear Kevin's screams. I see the grim resolve in Dave's eyes. And I feel the silent, humming presence of that place. They told me I destroyed it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator, I can still hear the static. A faint, gray whisper at the very edge of hearing. And I know I didn't kill it. You can't kill an idea. You can't destroy a law of physics. I only shattered the mirror. The pieces are still out there. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very soul, it's still listening. So, that's the story of Facility Panopticon. A story about how the ambition to achieve total information awareness, to see not just the past but the future, led to the creation of a prison where the inmates weren't people, but moments in time. It's a story that proves some doors are better left unopened, especially when they are buried deep beneath the Alaskan ice. Officially, the Ironwood site was a casualty of a tragic fire in 2005. But you and I both know the truth now. They didn't stop the project. They just learned a very hard lesson about what it costs to look into the abyss. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story made you think, or look over your shoulder at a flickering screen, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your own deep thoughts and theories in the comments below. Until next time, be careful what you wish to know, because some secrets once learned can never be forgotten. And sometimes, the static on the line isn't just interference. It's a sign that someone or something is listening.